Welcome to the Reflective Soul Podcast. I'm Dr. Nick Latursky, your guide on this journey through the intersection of psyche and spirit. Here we explore the depths of the human soul, uncovering the wisdom of symbols, dreams, myths, archetypes, and sacred stories. Whether you're seeking personal transformation, spiritual insight, or simply inspiration, this is a place for reflection, connection, and growth. Let's begin. Hello, and welcome again to the Reflective Soul Podcast. Today, the episode is inspired by a friend of mine. After listening to episodes 1 and 5 of the podcast, he reached out to me and said that he was really impressed that I was speaking freely about my own spiritual practices when I'm an academic teaching at a university. He wanted to let me know that he felt that my words were brave. This really got me thinking because the reality is it's a challenge to be fully open about your spiritual practices in a culture that is predominantly Christian. The challenge here is authenticity. We all want to live authentically. We all want to be ourselves and bring ourselves fully to the table. We want people to come from different perspectives and bring their different ideas and views. This is what makes society better, makes workplaces better. It makes our lives feel more enriched, and it gives us an opportunity to learn more from each other. But the reality, too, is that living authentically as a pagan, a magician, an occultist, an esotericist of any kind can really be a challenge in a society that often views so-called alternative spiritual practices with suspicion or misunderstanding. We do live in the United States in a predominantly Christian society, even though we see in the statistics that people are more and more saying they're not affiliated with any particular religion. So let's talk a little bit about how this Christian dominance in our culture creates unique pressures for occultists, magicians, and pagans. Some may know that our military, for example, is very Christian-oriented. And it's only been fairly recently that other religious symbols relating to pagan practices have been allowed on military gravestones, for example. We often worry when we want to be open with others about our spiritual practices. We're afraid of judgment. We're afraid of rejection. We're afraid of damage to our professional and personal relationships. We're afraid that they might perceive us as irrational or weird or even dangerous. So how do we balance this out? Because authenticity matters. There's a freedom and personal power that comes with being honest about your spiritual practices and sharing those with others in a respectful way. Plus, the importance of modeling authenticity for others lets them feel less isolated in their own spiritual journey. So let me tell you a couple stories. The first involves a get-together with a friend of the family. This individual has a PhD in metallurgy. He does high-end research work with materials for a major chip company. So he's truly brilliant. He also happens to be an atheist. He was visiting with us on one occasion, and somehow my magical practice came up. I think it may have been in reference to my temple room in the house. And watching his face was almost funny, because he was the type of person who would never in a million years say anything negative or disapproving vocally, but his face said everything. He was visibly shocked. His confusion was how an educated person could possibly engage in that sort of spirituality. It didn't really make a big change in our relationship. And if anything, like I said, I found it sort of amusing. But this still illustrates the challenge. This is exactly what we fear. In fact, we fear that things would go further, that this person would actually reject us if we are sharing with them openly. What this showed me is that there's a contrast between intellectual respect and spiritual misunderstanding. Even well-educated people can hold unconscious biases against so-called alternative spiritualities, just because they are raised in a culture that is predominantly Christian, even if they themselves don't practice Christianity. The challenge is to navigate the discomfort, to choose to remain open while also recognizing perhaps when we should hold back. I certainly don't share everything about my spiritual practice in terms of details, and there's a lot of wisdom in that. Now, my second story is about a conference that I presented at. Now, each year I go to a major conference in my primary discipline of depth psychology. I have a spiritual guidance master's degree. I have master's degrees and PhD in depth psychology. I have a law degree. So I can stack up against the best of them when it comes to piling on the degrees. But at this conference, these are people that I have really respected and admired over the years. Many of them have mentored me as I was a developing graduate student. And I've participated for a number of years in this conference, building my relationships there, building relationships of respect with my peers. And once I began teaching in my discipline of depth psychology, it even felt like the expectations were raised. A couple of years ago, I was presenting at the conference, and I really felt driven to talk about magic. I've been working on a book related to magic and the work of Carl Jung. Some people are familiar with what's called the Red Book. The Red Book is a beautiful large folio volume reproducing a book that Jung wrote and painted to illustrate his own process of dealing with his own unconscious. And this was a process over many years that formed the foundation of his later theories. It was a powerful, deep, intense time for him. The images and ideas in the Red Book are incredibly profound, almost to the point of feeling like scripture. One of the things that Jung did during this process was turn the images that came up in his imagination into physical objects. Part of this he did through the paintings that are included in the Red Book. Part of it he did in statues that still sit in his garden today in Küsnacht in Switzerland. These were very important icons almost. They were bringing the ideas and images of Psyche into physical reality in a way that he could engage them directly. As I was working through the Red Book, I found an entire section where Jung talks about magic, where he goes through an experience with a female figure that he refers to as his soul. And his soul begins to teach him about magic. Now, Jung was trying very hard to be an empiricist, a scientist, and not focus so much on mysticism or the esoteric, even though he had quite a collection in his library of esoteric texts. Soul, this female figure, told him that she was going to bring him items out of the depths and asked if he would be willing to receive them. And he said that he would receive anything that she brought to him. That's sort of a brave answer. So she dove into what he called the depths, and she brought forth all these items that are associated with magic, particularly among what are called cunning folk, or the magicians of communities, as opposed to so-called high magic. Jung described these as the superstitions of cultures gone by. Then Soul dove into the depths again and came forward the second time with papyri that had spells written on them, and various other objects that were associated with Greek and Roman culture and Egyptian culture. And these Jung called the precious treasures of ancient cultures. So there's an interesting dichotomy there in terms of class levels, if you will. The cultures that Europeans in general respected and admired, he saw as having greater value than these other things of more average members of their community. Then the next day, Soul asked again if he would receive what she brought to him, and he said he would. Soul then delivered to him a black rod, a magic rod, as he refers to it in his writing. The black rod was in the form of a serpent, with a gold bangle around its neck and pearls for eyes. And when he reached to take this, he was basically terrified. He didn't want to take on this irrational thing that he saw as magic. He saw it as terrible and burdensome and frightening. This was such an important image in the Red Book and in Jung's experiences that I would have expected him to put this into physical form, and yet he never did so. As I was working on my research, I felt compelled to bring the serpent rod into physical form. Now, I'm not much of an artisan, but I worked with another magician friend of mine who is very gifted, and we created together a reproduction of the serpent rod as Carl Jung had described it. It's a beautiful 2-foot long rod made of acacia wood, painted black, yes, with pearl eyes, and with a gold bangle painted around its neck. It's a beautiful piece of art with lovely engravings of the scales, a lovely curve to its body like a slithering serpent. It's a powerful item just in itself. After I received the serpent wand, I went through various magical rituals to consecrate it and bless it and make it something powerful in my own magical practice. So back to the preparation of the conference, I wanted to talk about Jung's experience with magic, and in particular, his experience with the serpent rod. Now, this was a vulnerable opportunity for me. Here again, I was coming before all these people who I deeply respected, and honestly, whose respect I wanted to earn. I was afraid of professional consequences from being open about my magical practice. I was afraid that they might react the way my metallurgist friend did, that they might very politely refuse to say anything negative, but that in their eyes I would see the sort of doubt and shock that a person with my education would engage in these spiritual practices. So I took the serpent rod with me to the conference in North Carolina. I had it carefully wrapped in linen, which is the tradition to protect objects like this. And after I got there, I had 2 or 3 days before my turn to present at the conference. And I tell you, I was nervous. I was full of anxiety. I was full of self-doubt. I was worried that putting this part of me out in front of my academic peers, my scholarly peers, was going to be a disaster. And I almost decided to give my presentation without using the serpent rod, even though there was a point in my presentation where I knew it was the right time to bring the rod out of its linen wraps and show it to everybody present. Well, fortunately, I didn't back out. I finally decided that night before to roll the dice, to let things fall where they would, to go forward, and whatever consequences happened would happen. The next day, I gave my presentation. I showed how Jung had wonderful books of magic, grimoires, in his library. I talked about his experience in the Red Book. And then, as I talked about Soul giving him the serpent rod, I brought out this 2-foot long recreation of Jung's serpent wand. If you've ever seen a football stadium where they practiced the wave, you could see the energy flow through the people in a very physical way. Well, I'm not saying the people in the room did the wave, but I could sense this powerful wave that went through the room. I could tell that what I was doing actually had an impact. And that wave came back to me, and honestly, I felt empowered. And I gave the rest of my presentation. And to be honest, it was the best conference presentation I feel that I've ever given. The Q&A afterward was terrific. I had great opportunities to talk about magic and talk about the intersection between magic and depth psychology. I came away feeling terrific about myself. Soon after, a former professor of mine invited me to speak as part of her series of lectures on arts-based research in depth psychology to give essentially the same presentation to her students there. I have found that one experience, instead of damaging my reputation, it has created new opportunities and collaborations. I have students who have various pagan or esoteric spiritual practices that feel comfortable coming to me with their questions and exploring ideas with me. I have people coming to me asking my opinion when they've had proposals to other journals to ask whether a proposal dealing with esoteric topics is well-grounded or not. I've had opportunities to teach. All these opportunities have come to me simply because I chose to be authentic. What's the broader lesson here? We do have to balance openness with safety. In fact, in some parts of the world, it could be dangerous to be open about your spiritual practices if you're not Christian. In the United States, there has a certain amount of social risk about it, but we can balance it. We don't need to go into all the details of our spiritual practice. We learn what to share and when to share, and what we want to keep personal and private to ourselves. Ultimately, we trust our intuition to gauge whether a particular situation is safe for our spiritual disclosure. We gain empowerment through vulnerability. Sharing our own spiritual truth, our own spiritual experience and journey can empower us, but also those who hear our story. That authenticity gives us a way to find our true community, those who will support us and celebrate us. It gives us an opportunity to find our tribe, if you will. And honestly, you'll be surprised just how large your tribe can be. Last May, I attended a conference in Halifax that was all about the idea of the devil. So there are people at this conference from all different disciplines, medievalists, people who studied the history of gender, people who studied neurodiversity, all sorts of backgrounds, including me as a depth psychologist. The fun part of this conference in bringing people together of all these different disciplines was that at first, everybody was trying to stay very academic in their conversations, very careful. But after a day or so, as everybody started warming up to each other, we found out just how many of us at the conference were actually esoteric practitioners. And the conversations and opportunities that arose from that were wonderful. I still have friends that I made at that conference that I keep in touch with. If you're considering coming out as an occultist or a magician or a pagan, start small. Test the waters with trusted friends or safe communities. See how they respond. Get a sense from that, what you feel comfortable sharing and what feels safer keeping private. Practice a simple, prepared response to potential questions or skepticism. This is an important thing. I've found many people have sort of looked askew at me and wondered, but I'm able to give a simple, short answer that simply says, this is my experience. This is my way of engaging the divine that I've found deeply rewarding after a long spiritual journey through many different traditions. Also, engage with supportive groups, both online and in person, so you can build your confidence. For those who are allies and listeners, think of how to offer support to those who are exploring alternative spiritualities. Show your curiosity, respect, and open-mindedness. Authenticity is always a profound act of self-love and self-respect, and that is just as true in your spiritual practice as in any other part of your life. Sharing your truth can transform both your life and the life of those around you. Take time to reflect on where you might need to bring more authenticity into your own life. And by all means, if you would like to reach out to me and share your stories, feel free to do so at my website or nick@dancingancestors.com. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Reflective Soul Podcast. If you're finding these episodes of value, please rate and give a review for this podcast at Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Those ratings and reviews really help to spread the word and gain more listeners so that I have more opportunity to share these important ideas of where spirituality and depth psychology intersect. Until next time, be well. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Reflective Soul Podcast. If this conversation resonated with you, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. When you do, please leave a review and share the podcast with your friends. Remember that your support helps this community grow and reach others who are seeking a deeper connection between themselves, the sacred, and the world around them. If you find yourself wanting to engage with more of my work, you can also find my spiritual guidance practice along with some of my writings at www.drnicklatursky.com. You can also follow me as Dr. Nick Latursky on Facebook or Blue Sky. Until next time, I'm Dr. Nick Latursky reminding you to trust your journey, honor your inner wisdom, and embrace the beauty of discovery. Be well.